Hello, good evening. I'm Silvia Davoli, curator of Strawberry Hill and one of the collaborators on the Jewish Country House project. And I'm here tonight to welcome everyone to our second virtual conversation for this symposium on Jewish dealers organized together with London Art Week. This evening, we will travel to Edwardian London, where art dealer Asher Wertheimer commissioned painter and friend John Singer Sargent to portray several members of his family. This commission resulted in the creation of 12 extraordinary portraits that are still admired today for their great originality. I'm honored to introduce for this session Jean Strouse, director of the Kalman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library until 2014. Jean is an internationally renowned writer and biographer. Among her books, I will mention only the biography of the diarist Alice James, younger sister of philosopher William and author Harry James, which in 1980 was awarded a Bancroft Prize. And the more recent biography of John Pierpont Morgan, arguably one of the greatest 20th century American collectors. At the moment, Jean is working on a new book focusing on the 12 Wertheimer portraits, and tonight, in conversation with Caroline Corbeau-Parsons, she will share with us some of this work in progress. Caroline was formerly curator of British art at Tate Britain, where she created many acclaimed exhibitions such as Impressionist in London, French Artist in Exile, and the more recent sole exhibition dedicated to the extraordinary Aubrey Beardsley. Caroline has been recently appointed curator of drawings at the Musée d'Orsay. Jean and Caroline will talk together for about 30-45 minutes before we open it up to questions from the floor. Please, at the end of the conversation, put your questions in the little Q&A box, and I will do my best to filter them for Jean. Thank you once again for joining us tonight, and over to you, Caroline. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Jean, we probably ought to say to start with that we met quite a few years ago, actually, thanks to our mutual friend, Richard Ormond, who is Sargent's great nephew and art historian extraordinaire, who has been compiling Sargent's catalogue raisonné with Elaine Kilmurray. And he put us in touch originally because you had just started your book on the Wertheimers. And back then I was already hoping to curate a display of the Wertheimer portraits at Tate. Now, my display has been postponed quite a few times, not least thanks to because of COVID. But our two undertakings are now coming together because the display is finally up at Tate Britain and it's on view at the moment. And we can expect your book to come out at the end of next year or maybe early 2023, if I'm right. So there's not long to wait now, which is great news. The Wertheimer portraits form an exceptional group. I think we can all agree with that, but in many ways. First of all, it was Sargent's largest commission. It is an exceptionally large group. And most importantly, perhaps, it includes some of his best and most acclaimed portraits. So I'd quite like to know what gave you the idea of writing the book to start with and how you encountered the Wertheimers.
Well, thank you, Caroline. And also I want to quickly thank Sylvia and Tom Stammers and Brian E. Truscott and everyone involved in this for their help. And also to say that the conversation yesterday between Charles Delheim and James Macaulay was fantastic. So I'm thrilled to be part of this. I did not know anything about Wertheimers. I did know about Sargent, both of my previous books. He had cameo appearances in both of my previous books. The Jewish Museum in New York organized an exhibition of all the 12 Wertheimer portraits, but I didn't see it in New York. I was doing some work in Seattle, and the art museum was not far from my hotel, and I saw Sargent and went to see it and was really knocked out by the portraits themselves. There were a number of photographs that the family had generously lent that showed Sargent visiting them at their country house. They were all on the lawn, ready to play croquet. And the idea of Sargent working on a Jewish family was just a complete surprise to me. And they looked not unlike members of my own family. And, you know, once in a while you get that feeling that just this is a subject I need to know more about. But I had just finished my Morgan book and I really wasn't ready to embark on a new project. So I bought the catalog, came back to New York, took a big job, but it didn't leave me alone. And I wrote to several people who knew about this or who were connected to it, and to find out whether there might be more information about these people, because there's a wonderful catalog that the Jewish Museum had put together when they did that exhibition, which traveled to, it was New York, New Orleans, Virginia, and Seattle. And everyone said, no, there wasn't much, that the Wertheimer records had been lost and so on. Richard Ormond was wonderful. He's wonderful in every way. And he said he thought it would be a great subject, but that there just wouldn't be enough information. It's a long story, but I did see one of the Wertheimer descendants had responded online to someone who had asked about one of the portraits, and he gave his email address. This was Julian Matthias. So I immediately wrote to him and said, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? And we then talked by phone, and he introduced me to many other members of his family. And there is more information. There's not a ton after writing about the James family and J.P. Morgan, where there are huge archives and records. There's very little about the Wertheimers. And Sargent was a wonderful note writer, not long letters, but great notes, very witty. His handwriting is very difficult to decipher, especially in French. But after meeting I went to England, I met with everyone in the family that I could. And anyway, so I did start to do this in about 2013, but I still had a full-time job. So I was doing research, and I left that job in 2017 in order to write this book. And now I'm in the second to last chapter.
Good. So it was actually the display that got you started. That's very interesting. And we should also thank Kathy Adler and Norman Kleeblatt, who curated this amazing exhibition.
Absolutely. So yes, it was the exhibition and the idea of the friendship between, well, clearly there was a strong friendship between Sargent and members of this family. And that was really what I wanted to know most about.
Yes. So I'll just, if the slides work. There we go. So just a little glimpse into the display that's on at the moment at Tate. There are only 10 portraits in it because it focuses on the bequests, on Asher Wertheimer's bequest to the nation. We'll come back to this later. And I think perhaps we should introduce the cast to start with, and maybe show all the portraits so that we can admire all of Sargent's extraordinary portraits and explain slightly who they were. So do you want to do the introductions, Jean?
Sure. And I'll say we're going to just look at them briefly now, and then we're going to come back and talk about a few of them in more detail as we go through. So this is Asher in 1898 and his wife Flora also that year. They didn't like the one of Flora, so Sargent did another one 6 years later. And the next come the eldest daughters, Ina, named after her grandmother, Helena, and Betty. Ina's the taller one, Betty's in red.
To the right, yes.
Red velvet and white satin. Are the two eldest brothers, Edward on the left, who was in joining the firm with his father. He was the only one who was going into the art dealing business. But he died in his 20s, which was tragic. And then Alfred, who was a chemist, and he too died in his 20s. So the eldest two sons by 1902 were gone.
And we should probably say that both portraits are actually unfinished. It's very obvious in the portrait of Edward, but perhaps less so in the portrait of Alfred. But the background of the portraits is unfinished.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Edward is clearly unfinished. Not so clear with Alfred. Thank you. And this is the second portrait of Flora, the wife, done after her sons had died, 2 years after she had died. And we can talk a little bit about why they didn't like the first one, but this is quite a masterpiece, grave, sorrowing, and extraordinary. And just in the color scheme, it goes better with Asher in his dark clothing and dark backgrounds. And he hung 8 of these paintings in the dining room at his house at 8 Connaught Place. And he and this Flora were facing each other in that arrangement. This is Sargent did the elder children more or less individually. He did 2 groups of the younger ones, and this is my favorite younger one. It's quite great. There are Ruby on the left, who was the youngest in the family. She was 13 at the time. Then Essie, who's 22, and Ferdinand, who was just older than Ruby. And look at all the dogs. Asher's poodle is next to Ruby on the floor. He's also in the portrait of Asher, as we'll come back to. And then they're all holding, the girls are both holding dogs. And it's, well, we'll talk about this later. And Hilda was the 3rd daughter. That is not a very satisfying picture in my opinion. She refused to take off her spectacles. And she just looks awkward, and the picture is a bit awkward, as if those flowers are spiky and reaching out and going to grab her dress. This is the 2nd group of younger children, and Hilda, although it's after the one that we're looking at on the left, she looks much younger in this one in the foreground, holding a dog with her hand under her chin, and her brother Conway standing behind, and their sister Almina on the right in a riding outfit. And this is another spectacular one, Avele Gonfie, which we're going to, Gonfie, sorry, I always get that wrong. We'll talk about that later as well. This is Ina again, who was Sargent's favorite. She's a force of nature and going to take up a lot of my book. And another daughter, Almina, clearly in Oriental garb and pose. This is a very interesting portrait. Sargent, I think, was playing around here and also in the one with Ina, which we'll talk about. The instrument she's holding, she's clearly play acting. It's a sarod, an Indian sarod that you don't play in that position at all. She's just holding it there in that way in a man's Turkish coat that Sargent used on several other occasions at around this time. This is the last one of the Wertheimer series. There's one more we're going to see in a second, but the last 2 were done in 1908. And it went in a morning room adjacent to the dining room where all the other 8 were.
Yeah, so it was painted at the time when Sargent had actually given up portraiture.
Yes. Do we need to see Betty at the very end?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I'm so used to only seeing the Tate portraits that I forgot the others. Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you. So yes, in 1908, Sargent said no more portraits. He was thoroughly sick of them. He just wanted to be free to travel and paint landscapes and be with his friends and paint from nature. And he was also working on a big commission for the Boston Public Library of murals. So he did Almina and Betty in 1908, and these are the last Wertheimer portraits. He did some other ones of his good friends after that, but mostly he stopped doing portraits then. So this is Betty in a sort of 18th century British portrait mode. She ultimately sold it, and it's now at the Smithsonian at the National Museum of American Art in Washington, D.C.
That's right. So all 12 portraits were on show in the 1990s, but at Tate only 10, just to warn you. So it would be quite interesting to talk about this commission, because presumably at first Asher didn't really think of commissioning portraits of his entire family. So this comes at the time of their silver wedding, as you said, silver wedding anniversary. But it also came at a time when Asher was clearly being very successful as an art dealer at the time when he sells the Hope collection. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about the commission and whether you think Asher already was thinking of commissioning portraits of the entire family.
Thank you. Yes, we don't really know how the commission came about, how they met even. Asher had a gallery in New Bond Street. It's quite possible that Sargent visited it, and they had a number of friends in common. So it could have come about any number of ways. And as you say, Asher and Flora celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1896, and Asher commissioned these paintings then. And the first two were of him and his wife. And we also don't know for sure whether he had in mind the whole family or not. But clearly, although the painting of Asher, which we're going to get to in a minute, was extremely controversial, Asher loved it and went on and commissioned 10 more. So that's some evidence of their friendship and of his esteem for this work. Let me just give you a quick thumbnail of where Asher and Sargent were in 1897 when this commission was begun. The Wertheimers, the Wertheimers have a very illustrious ancestor, Samson Wertheimer, who he was born in Worms, but he lived in Vienna, and he in the 1680s, 90s up till 1724 when he died. He was court factor, which is also court Jew, to 3 Holy Roman emperors in Vienna. He was the wealthiest and most powerful Jew at the time, and there weren't banking systems, so the rulers needed to raise money from various other sources, and often it was through these figures called court Jews. He was also, in addition to his very successful career with as financier to these emperors, he was also a leading Talmudic scholar, an honorary rabbi of several countries and cities, and he was protecting Jews throughout the Holy Roman Emperor a time and again. And his children all married into other wealthy German Jewish families. So by the beginning of the 19th century, Asher's father, another Samson Wertheimer, was born in Fürth in Bavaria. And that it was not a great place to live if you were Jewish. There were all kinds of restrictions placed on Jews. And this Samson Wertheimer left in 1839 and came to England. He was an artisan, he worked in bronze, and he had somehow learned a great deal about the leading French furniture makers and decorative artists of the 18th century in France, which was exactly what the British markets wanted. Don't know how much of that he knew in Bavaria and how much he learned once he got to England, but once he did, he settled in the East End briefly, married a woman from Fürth, had 2 sons, and by the early 1850s, he had opened a gallery in New Bond Street. So he was making his own work, and he was also beginning to trade in the decorative arts and furniture that these markets very much wanted. He was extremely successful, starting, we think, with pretty much nothing, because the money from the ancestor had really run out by the early 19th century. Both of his sons became art dealers, Asher and his older brother, Charles, and they too were extremely successful. Samson, the father, handled the Hamilton Palace sale, which was a very important one in 1882. And among his first clients in the 1850s were Rothschilds. And the Rothschilds remained primary clients of the Wertheimers for the rest of for the rest of Charles and Asher's lives. And of course, those would be the clients you would want if you were making your reputation in England and it was a kind of validation of how good the Wertheimers were at this job of buying art from old estates and selling it to people who wanted it now in the present tense, then the present tense. Also, the Duke of Edinburgh, who was the second son of Victoria and Albert, commissioned Samson Wertheimer in 1874 to redecorate the rooms in Clarence House for himself and his new wife, who was a daughter of the Tsar. So he was very, very well respected and known to be extremely good at what he was doing. He died in 1892, leaving quite a substantial fortune. And Asher took over his firm on Bond Street. Charles, the older brother, went off on his own and sold out of his house. We maybe talk about Charles later. So that's not quickly enough, a summary of them. And Sargent was American, although he was born in Florence and lived traveling through Europe until he never even visited America until he was 20. He went to Paris to study art. The whole family moved to Paris so that he could study art in 1874, which he did study. He quickly became very successful, showing at the Salon and many other places. He greatly admired Manet and Ingres. He became friends with Monet. He had a number of extremely successful early paintings, which are spectacular. He also famously painted Madame X, which caused a huge scandal in Paris. We don't have time to go into that now, but he thought—
1884.
I'm sorry?
No, yes, in 1884, yes.
1884, Madame Corbeau. And it shocked Paris. You wouldn't think Paris would be that shockable, but for various reasons, it did. And he thought he might have to give up painting at that point. But he moved to London. He went to England at the suggestion of his friends Henry James and Whistler, and painted a very Monet-influenced painting called Carnation Lily, Lily Rose, which everyone probably knows, and then began getting more and more commissions from America, and then in the early 1890s from England. So by the time Asher commissions him to do these portraits, Sargent is the leading portrait artist on both sides of the Atlantic. And he is very well accepted on both sides, but Americans regard him sort of as one of theirs and also as European, and Europeans regard him as American, but the British claim him as their artist. So it's very complicated and interesting. So
controversial. And Sargent is British at Tate Britain and yes, American at the National Gallery.
Yes, exactly.
So this goes on.
He never gave up his American citizenship. And he said to Whistler, when he was elected to the Royal Academy, he said to Whistler, if anyone asks about my nationality, tell them I am an American. I keep my twang, he said.
And he declined a knighthood, didn't he?
Declined a knighthood.
Yes, to keep his nationality.
Yes, exactly. So,
what's quite interesting with Asher is also that he married Flora, who was also coming from a dealing family.
Yeah.
And thinking of Charles, his brother, Charles commissioned Millet to paint his portrait and the portrait of his wife.
Yes.
So what do you think it meant to choose Sargent at this precise moment?
Let me dial back for a little second to talk about Charles. Charles commissioned Millet before Asher commissioned Sargent to do these. It wasn't his wife, however, it was his mistress. Charles had gone to Germany and brought back a wife from Fürth. I imagine she was pregnant when they got back because they very quickly had twins, and they moved in with his parents rather than getting a house of their own. They had 2 more children, and then within 10 years of their marriage, Charles took off with a much younger woman and left his family in his father's care. And one of the descendants has told me that that when the Asher's children misbehaved, they were threatened with being sent to live with wicked Uncle Charlie. And Charles was a very, very complicated character. Again, we don't have time to go into now, but his professional, he was a very good dealer, but cut a lot of ethical corners. So he commissioned Millet, and those paintings are okay. They're not terribly interesting. He commissioned, so then Sargent in 1898 starts doing the Wertheimer, the Asher family, and they're all shown at the Royal Academy almost as soon as they're finished, they go to the Royal Academy. And Charles, of course, was observing this. He lived in Norfolk Street, Park Lane. And in 1904, he commissioned William Orpen, then a very young artist who was sharing a studio with Augustus John, to do more portraits of himself. So I think there was definitely a rivalry here, but Orpen was a very interesting painter, but they don't measure up to these. And Orpen knew that. He did a wonderful sketch of himself pleading with Sargent, in which he was very small, and he's standing there with his hands out begging, and Sargent towers over him like a giant, sort of looking down. And so anyway.
So this was quite a coup, really, for Asher.
Yes.
To be painted by Sargent, and they may have had professional links, but we are not 100% sure. Or maybe you have new information on this, but no, because there's very little. And what is really incredible, I mean, it was quite an achievement to be able to be painted by Sargent, but for the entire family to be painted by Sargent was almost unheard of. And this is by far the largest commission. And perhaps we can go briefly into the controversy of these portraits. I think when they were exhibited one by one at the Royal Academy, they were very well perceived. But when they were seen as a large group, this became, the perception of these portraits were perhaps slightly different.
Yes. Yes, while Sargent was working on them, he said that he complained to a friend that he was in a state of chronic Wertheimerism, which was amusing, but he was, especially in 1901-2, he was constantly doing Wertheimers. And the, sorry, I just have to fix something on my screen. And Asher mock complained that there were not more Wertheimers for Sargent to paint. So they were both, I think, pleased with this. Sargent might have been a little exhausted by it. So you're correct that Asher gave 9 of the portraits to the National Gallery. He pledged them in 1916, and but they didn't give them outright because he was still living with them. He had 8 of them in his dining room, which, because Sargent was such a frequent guest at their house, and loved good food, which the Wertheimers had in abundance. The dining room was called Sargent's Mess, and there were 2 more in other rooms. So he died in 1918, and his wife had a life interest in them. And then in 1923, they were immediately transferred to the National Gallery, which put all 9 of them up in one room in January of 1923. And I'm going to read you some quotes, because even as they came out, they were a bit controversial. The painting of Asher, maybe we can look at that. Well, yeah, we've got it. It has been a Rorschach test ever since it was painted. Partly, the great portraits lend themselves to multiple interpretations, and this is really a case in point. It's enigmatic a bit, and it largely, his ethnicity, his clear Jewishness is a big part of what people were responding to. When it was first shown at the Royal Academy in 1898, reviewers called it, I'm just going to read because I can't get that up on my screen, so I'm looking at a piece of paper. They called it a masterpiece on which all artistic eyes have been fixed since the opening day, and nothing short of amazing. It would be very hard to name any other modern painter we could rank with this for sheer power of expression. And one reviewer concluded, happy the man whose portrait has been painted thus. That was in 1898. On the other hand, even then, at the beginning, a visitor who saw the painting in Sargent's studio said that Asher, who's got his right thumb in his pocket and is holding a cigar in his left hand, that Asher appeared to be pleasantly engaged in counting golden shekels. And Henry Adams told a friend that, as for me, I admire Dreyfus, but Sargent has just completed another Jew, Wertheimer, a worse crucifixion than history tells us of. Then 25 years later, when they're on display at the National Gallery, the Times says the set of portraits is an acquisition of almost incalculable value to the national collections and a great monument to the genius who painted it. But there was a debate in Parliament about this gift that is pretty ugly. One MP asked about the size of the gift and wanted to know, is there any other gallery or family that has given this many pictures to the national collections. And the implication was this is Jewish excess. And then there was another member, and one of his co-members said that maybe he would like this member would like to have his painting in the National Gallery, to which everyone laughed. But then the member from Oxford, who was actually a professor of history at Oxford, rose and asked the chair of the committee, can the right honorable gentleman manage that these clever but extremely repulsive pictures should be placed in a special chamber of horrors and not between the brilliant examples of the art of Turner? So there is the worst of the extremes of this response. I mean, portraits have traditionally been of aristocrats, of royals, of church leaders, merchant princes, not of Jews, and certainly not in this number. The scarcity of Jews in the upper reaches of British and American society account to an extent for the concerted focus on the Wertheimers' Jewish identity, Jewish features. To Anglo-Saxon eyes, Jews appeared foreign, exotic, oriental, distinctly different from themselves. And some of the comments on the type were mere observations, but even praise for the portraits underline how exotic Jews looked to Anglo-Saxon eyes. Sargent did paint quite a number of Jews. Several of them were also his friends. And he came to be known as the painter of Jews around London. Over the course of his life, he did about 1,400 portraits in oil and in charcoal, of which about 40 were of Jewish sitters. He also did thousands of landscapes and figure studies, watercolors. So 40 out of 1,400 is a really small percent.
It's not exactly a large proportion.
About 3%, actually. But that the leading chronicler of transatlantic high society would choose to paint these subjects was evidently striking enough to earn him the epithet painter of Jews. And few of them look as manifestly Semitic as Asher does. His expression, his slight smile and penetrating gaze can be read as warm, wise, and benevolently amused, or as, Shylockian, counting golden shekels. Asher was an expert on Rembrandt, to whose painting great, unsparing portraits his were often compared. And I believe that he embraced Sargent's rendering completely. He was once claiming a place in the history of art and in alignment with British aristocrats. This was something that Charles Delheim, was talking about yesterday, about the aspirations of dealers to become part of the aristocracy or the reigning social structures of the societies they were in. And I think that Asher wanted to place his family alongside the great portraits by Lawrence and Reynolds and Rembrandt and Van Dyck and Velázquez, along with, as well as put his friend Sargent alongside those painters. So he himself was by the subjects and was one of the subjects, and his friend was the painter. And I think his specific ethnic identity was fine with him. He's saying, this is who I am. This is what I look like. So
yes.
I mean, many of his friends were offended, but he obviously was not. He went on to commission 10 more.
Yes, and when you look at his photographs, actually, the likeness is very striking, and it's something that people commented on
yes.
in complimentary terms at the salon. Do you think people discuss Sargent as the painter of Jews because Sargent prioritized these portraits at exhibitions? I mean, he chose the portrait of Asher to show at the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1900. He decided to show Ina and Betty there.
Yes.
Incidentally, at the time of the Dreyfus affair.
Exactly. Exactly.
So do you think that Sargent also wanted to make that point and wanted to make a statement?
I do think so. I think that as you said, the Exposition in 1900, he showed Asher Wertheimer, Mrs. Karl Mayer and her children, who was also Jewish. They were the Jewish family, and the president of Bryn Mawr. So that was an odd trio for him to show at this expo. And he won prizes for it. But I do think it was absolutely at the height of the Dreyfus affair. And that quietly he was signaling his alliance with the Dreyfusards. And in 1905, when he showed Ina at the Royal Academy, we'll get to that later, the single portrait, Adèle Gonfier, it was right when the England passed an Aliens Act. There had been floods of Eastern European Jewish immigrants coming into England, and the powers that be wanted to stop that, or at least limit it. And I think that he may have been signaling his alliance with the Wertheimers and Jews with that display as well. So yes, I do think so.
Yeah, we're not quite sure why they were not pleased with the likeness of Flora in the first portrait.
Right.
But I mean, we can only speculate. It's a slightly more conventional portrait. Interestingly, the portrait of Asher was criticized for showing wealth, which again is a comment that shows prejudice, probably because actually it's not too blatant. It's a very sober portrait with nothing flashy in the background. Whereas the first portrait of Flora maybe showed a few more pearls, and maybe we can speculate that maybe it didn't resemble her personality from that point of view. But
one of her descendants said they thought it made her look too rich. She thought it made her look too rich, but we don't know really. I think it's not as alive as the portrait of Asher, as a companion, as a pendant.
That's true.
And just another quick sidestep. One of the criticisms of Sargent is that he was just painting people to flatter them and getting commissions and catering to people's vanity. Many people did not like the portraits that he did of them and rejected them, or
because they felt they were not glamorous enough.
Yes. Or whatever reason. Yeah. So and this is a case in point. I mean, Asher could have rejected his own portrait if he didn't like it, but he didn't. They rejected the one of Flora, and she ultimately gave it to one of her daughters, and it was sold. It's now in New Orleans.
But certainly, I mean, fine, they were not happy with the first portrait of Flora. Mm-hmm. But another comment that was made about the Wertheimer portraits is that they are so good and really stand out in Sargent's oeuvre because of his friendship with the sitters, and it's very apparent in the portrait of Ina and Betty. And maybe you want to say something about his friendship with Ina, who was probably the family member he was closest with.
Yes. She's, as I said before, the taller girl, and when he was working on it, an American painter visited his studio, and he said, "What do you think of this?" He said, "Isn't the taller girl handsome?" And then a few minutes later, he came back again and said, "Isn't Miss Wertheimer beautiful?" He was very, very taken with her looks, and he shows her. I mean, these girls they were in their 20s. They're full of life and warmth and vitality. They're about to step out into the room and into their lives. Ina's dress is practically falling off. Betty's a later close examination of the painting showed that Betty's strap was initially off her shoulder, and he moved it back up, shades of Madame X. That study also showed that all the colors in the room are present in Ina's dress. We see it as white, but it's full. I mean, and he loved painting white. We can talk about that. He loved painting shadows too. She's got her hand on this tall Chinese jar, which was the kind of thing Asher Wertheimer would have had. Those were the kinds of objects he was dealing in, so they were throughout the house. And
but that's the dining room, isn't it, at Connaught Place? That's meant to be the That was painted in the dining room, yes.
I'm not sure which room, but probably with paintings behind it. I don't know. It's most of them were done in Sargent's studio. So this was one of.
Sorry, I meant the drawing room, I think. Sorry, not the dining room, the drawing room, I think.
Okay, I'm not sure about that. But it's one of the only ones that was actually done at the house, because most of them were done in his studio. And it was obviously finished in his studio. But he and Ina were very close from very early on. She was a life force, as you can see. And she wanted to be a painter and did go to the Slade Art School and then married. And I'll come back to her when we get to Albert de Confi. But the writer Wilfred Scowen Blunt said that, this was a few years out later, but he said that Sargent paints nothing but Jews and Jewesses now, and says he prefers them as they have more life and movement than our English women, which absolutely you see in this picture. There's just, they are about to come to life. This is very dazzling, this painting. I don't need to say too much more about it. He's showing off a bit with Betty's right arm, which is long and extended and turned out and extended with her fan. That's a difficult thing to do, and he does it beautifully.
Yes, it's an extraordinary piece of painting with, yes, done in just it's very impressionistic when you look at it from close up.
Yes. Well, you've probably looked at it close up more than before. A medical student, people said that arm is just too long anatomically, it's not correct, but some medical student took photographs of 20 arms and established that in fact it was just fine. Yeah, so I mean, I think that he was really documenting, I'm not the first person to say this, Elizabeth Predejean has said it a lot in a book about Sargent. He was really showing the transitions at the upper levels of the social world in England, and new women, the aristocracy sort of on the decline, although still looking pretty great. But there was a dramatic flux in the late 19th century in English society as the aristocracy was losing income. The competition from American grains had really affected British agriculture, which was the basis of a lot of the upper class income, a lot of aristocratic income. And so these wonderfully wealthy, formerly wealthy families had estates and houses and art collections and beautiful daughters and no income. And the new plutocracy, Rothschilds, JP Morgan, Frick, wanted what these aristocrats had. They were very eager to buy the art that had belonged to these families, which is what Asher, the Wertheimers put themselves right in between those two groups. They would also marry the sons and daughters marry their sons and daughters to wealthy Americans or others, but art was portable and sellable, and its value was rising as the value of land was going down. So there is this dramatic social change going on, and there are new women, new bankers, new wealthy people really surfacing at this time in a very dramatic way. And I think Sargent was fascinated by that, as Henry James was, who was a very good friend of his, and that he was capturing it rather than just sort of, as sometimes been charged, just sort of validating the status quo. I think he was documenting change.
It's also a sign of the great friendship in the family that this was actually painted in the house at Connaught Place, because Sargent was quite the star, and he would very rarely travel to his sitter's house,
right,
to paint portraits.
Right.
And Devine was, of course, tapping into this social, taking advantage of these social changes, and right. But Asher's style as an art dealer was quite different from Devine's. It was a lot more discreet, wasn't it?
Indeed. Are we running out of time? It looks like we might be, in which case maybe should we
Let's move on to, do you want to say something again about Edward and Alfred, or I think we have?
So. And yeah, and
so maybe Ina's portrait, which is
yes. So this she came. This was she came to his studio to sit for this portrait with her cloak and scarf billowing out behind her. She was rushing in. She was late, as she often was, and he decided he wanted to paint her that way. So avele gonfie means in full sail. That's what he wanted. So he, the Duke of Marlborough, he was painting the Marlborough family at the same time, at first at Blenheim, but then finishing it in the studio. And the Duke left his garter robes there. And so Ina and Sargent put Ina in these, or the order, his clothing, his order of his garter outfit, which only Queen Victoria and later Edward VII made his wife, Queen Alexandra, a female order of the garter, but it was men all up and always. And so here's Ina, not aristocratic, not male, not in any way at this level of nobility, dressed as a dashing cavalier in this cloak and a fantastic feathered hat. You can see on the right side of the picture a little, he asked her to hold a broomstick under the cloak to keep it billowing out the way he wanted it to look. And it's a delicious picture. And this sort of got cross-dressing and sexual appeal in it. And they were really having fun. And this was shown at the Royal Academy in 1905, the same time the the Marlborough family was shown. So this cloak appears in both paintings in different galleries, and I haven't found anyone commenting on that, but maybe they noticed and maybe they didn't.
The cloak of the Order of the Garter is
Yes.
midnight blue, so Sargent made sure maybe he was not going one step too far, and so this one is black and maybe therefore slightly less controversial, but the hat is certainly very recognizable.
Yeah.
Shall we? I can see that we are actually running out of time. I think we've got about 10 minutes left. What do you think? Shall we just talk slightly about the bequest? Because this is very unusual in itself. I mean, they had to, so the bequest was not made to the Tate, it has to be said. Right. It was made to the National Gallery. And then the bequest was transferred to Tate in 1926. Mm-hmm. But before Asher made this fantastic gift to the nation, he also gave a bust of Flora Wertheimer by Havard Thomas, who was much admired by Sargent. So, you know, there's this first gift, right. And you know, his collection was very important, his personal collection, and Asher never bequeathed any work by old masters to museums, as far as I know, but correct me if I'm wrong. But yet he gave all these portraits to the nation, 9 of them, and Avele Gonfi actually joined the Tate collection later on, right. Thanks to another generous family gift by Robert Matthias. So that was in the 90s. So what do you think Asher was trying to do with these bequests? Do we know about his intentions?
We don't. But I think that, you know, he was a very self-confident person. He had a sense of his own heritage, which wasn't the same as the heritage of the Marlboroughs, certainly, but he felt it to be extremely valuable. And I think that he was very much of an expert on old masters, on 18th century British portraits, on French decorative arts. And I think he wanted his family to be seen in the context of those works that were at the National Gallery, and wanted Sargent to be seen alongside the great painters who were all over the walls of the National Gallery and still are. He wanted them to stay there in one room, which is almost never possible and did not prove to be possible. The family was not pleased about that. They did go to the Tate and were shown in 1926 in the Turner galleries, so that nasty remark by the MP who said, do we have to have these on our walls for all time next to the beautiful examples of the work of Turner? Guess what? Guess where they ended up? Right next to the works of Turner. So I think it was all of that. And that was part of why people saw it as objectionable. What are these people doing here? Yeah.
It's not just about Sargent, is it? Because there are two unfinished portraits in the bequests.
Right.
And that was not discussed at all at the National Gallery when the bequest was accepted.
Right.
I think it must, and also, I mean, it was the first time that a living artist entered the National Gallery. So again, that was against the rule.
It wasn't actually. They said that, but there were many other examples. First of all, Sargent was already there. There were several other.
Yes,
Sargent,
the other Sargent, of course.
But there were many others. Everyone thought that, and everyone said that. But I dug around, and there were several exceptions. And it actually comes up in that parliamentary hearing when the Chancellor of the Exchequer says, no, there's this and this and this. But yes, it was unusual. And there was even a cartoon in Punch with a lot of old masters gathered on the steps of the National Gallery, and Sargent is haltingly walking up the steps, and they're saying to him, well done, young master, you're the first of us to get in here alive, which again wasn't true, but it was a very good cartoon. But one other thing I wanted to say about this is that because Asher's eldest sons died young, and Charles only had two sons who also died in their 20s, it's quite a tragic family for both sides. No, the name Wertheimer ended when in the art dealing world ended in 1918 when Asher died. So it was two generations, basically from about the 1850s to 1918. And that goes some way toward explaining why the Wertheimer name isn't as well known as some others, Agnews, Kolnagi, Duveen, certainly. And so we would not be talking about Wertheimers today were it not for these Sargent portraits. So in that sense, Asher, I mean, I don't know whether he could have imagined 2021, but I think he was making a bid for this to be a permanent part of the cultural legacy of England, both for Sargent and for himself and his own family. If we have time, there's a wonderful tribute to him by a journalist who knew him, but I think we need to have time for questions, don't we?
I think we've got another 5 minutes maybe before questions, I think.
Oh, I thought we had.
Okay, maybe not. Maybe
Sylvia.
actually.
Sylvia.
Okay, then you're quite right.
Yeah.
Sylvia?
Yeah, sorry. I was I mean, thank you so much, Jean and Caroline, for the fascinating conversation. And I mean, amazing also how you managed to bring us at the art of these incredible, I mean, it was really an incredible gift to the National Gallery. I mean, amazing, almost revolutionary, I would say. And for such an interesting conversation, I have to say we have many questions. So I will do my best now to convey, I mean, to choose the most interesting. One interesting question is about how did Sargent actually react to the critical reception for his portraits of Jewish subjects? Whether we know if, I mean, how did he take these very harsh critics?
Caroline can answer that as well. I think he was used to getting criticized, and he probably didn't think too much over it. He had a stamp, a rubber stamp that he used on things that said with the word damn on it. And he said there was some critical comment about one of the portraits, and he sent it to Ina with that damn stamped on it. But I think it didn't really faze him. Caroline, what do you think?
I think, well, Sargent never engaged in controversy. He was, that was not his style at all. But I think the fact that he kept on exhibiting these portraits and the fact that he exhibited Asher and Ina and Betty's portraits at the Exposition Universelle was very much a statement, a discreet one, but a powerful one that I think would have have been heard back then.
Yeah, and it's amazing how it's true. Also comparing these portraits to other, Jewish bankers, or other portraits of the time. It's really astonishing, the degree of modernity, and also this kind of public statement that was unusual. Which such a force. There is another very interesting question about whether there was a discussion whether this group should go to the National Portrait Gallery rather than the National Gallery. I think it's an interesting question, because obviously the National Portrait Gallery is a specific British institution, and it's usually, is the logic, should be the logic container for portraits.
I don't know the answer to that. We might ask Richard Ormond, who knows everything and certainly knows about the National Portrait Gallery, but I have not, in all these years of working on this, I have not come across, and both Caroline and I have sort of combed through the National Gallery's archive in discussions the kind of correspondence and press clippings about these portraits, and I haven't come across anything about the Portrait Gallery. Have you, Caroline?
No, but it was Asher's specific will, that it should go to the National Gallery. Right. But also, pictures at the National Gallery have to be of very distinguished people. I'm not saying that Asher was not, but he would, usually people who were no longer living to start with, which wouldn't have worked for the whole bequest, because Asher's children were obviously still living. So the whole bequest would not, I think, have been accepted at the National Portrait Gallery.
Okay, thank you. And another question is about whether the Wertheimers were practicing Jews.
That is a very good and rather complicated question. They were certainly, they definitely remained Jewish. They didn't try to deny their Judaism at all. Asher was involved in a number of charitable events for Jews, as was Charles, and their father made gifts of objects in honor of when his wife died. He gave things to the Central Synagogue. He gave Torah covers. But when Asher died, the obituary in the Times said that Samson and his sons were thoroughly anglicized in thought and action. And they were all buried, most of them at the Willesden Jewish Cemetery. They belonged to the Central Synagogue, most of them. I can't remember the name of the historian who coined this phrase, but they saw themselves as English people of the Jewish persuasion. So they weren't, and many of Charles was probably more actively engaged with Jewish things than Asher was. Of Asher's children, only 3 of them married Jews. And the next generation, almost no one remained Jewish. But for Samson, Asher, and Charles, they definitely did.
Thank you, Jean. And there is another question always related to the Wertheimer and the Jewishness. One of our listener was noticing that some of the Wertheimers' sons eventually changed their name, the surname, to Conway. So is this does this suggest a move away from the Jewishness, or there are other reasons behind?
Well, it was 2 of the sons. It was in 1916, and the older 2 sons had already died, and the 2 who changed the names were Conway Joseph Wertheimer and his younger brother Ferdinand Wertheimer. And it was 1916 at the height of World War I. And ostensibly it was so as not to sound German, which was a big deal, to not allow like many German Jews in England wrote letters to the Times saying they had nothing to do with Germany, no sympathy with Germany, and really establishing very clear lines. Conway was running for Parliament in 1916, and people criticized his name and his alliance with Germany. So it was at that point that they made the change. But I'm sure it was also so as not to sound just so Jewish. And Conway married a woman who was not Jewish. Ferdinand Wertheimer became Bob Conway. and was gay, and lived with a man for most of his adult life. And when he died, he was buried in an Anglican cemetery, but there was, I can't now remember the exact details, but there was a Jewish star on his tombstone. So I think it was like wanting to have it both ways.
Yes. And there is another very interesting question that is about the portrait of Almina, dressed up with an Oriental costume. Mm-hmm. And this person was wondering whether this was just a dressing up, or there were other reasons behind. I don't know, like that I'm a collector of Asian art or other things.
We can both answer this. There is definitely, you know, as I said earlier, Jews were seen as exotic and Oriental, and there are Oriental little touches throughout this series. Asher standing in front of an Oriental screen. Flora there's an Oriental little porcelain next to her on the desk. Ina has her hand on the tall Chinese jar. So the three youngest children, that the room was compared to, it could be a harem den or something like that. It's sort of got an exotic sensual feel, and people responded that way. With Almina, I think somewhat like with Ina here, he was playing around. And here you have a Jewish woman seen as Oriental. Many European aristocrats in the 18th century there was a rage for Turkery, and they would dress up as Turkish and have parties where everybody came in costume and posed. There were a number of paintings of women posing in Turkish costume, Madame de Pompadour. There are lots of them. And I think Sargent is almost engaged here in a triple play. He's got a Jewish Oriental woman wearing an Oriental costume, dressing up, imitating European women dressing up in Oriental costume, and also alluding to the very famous Ingres portrait, Odalisque with a slave, which he knew well because his friend Philip Sassoon owned it, and he had been trying to sell it in America. So there are many levels in which he's, I think, having a lot of fun with this.
Yes, it's very multi-layered, and I think there are other artistic references, but there's ongoing research, you know, on this. But it's definitely playful, yes. And it looks as if there's, you know, Almina is part of the game, mm-hmm. And we have reasons to believe that maybe Sargent was gay, so you don't have the traditional male gaze on what would be a traditional Orientalist picture. So it becomes very complex. But there's definitely an element of dressing up, because Sargent had this huge textile collection that included this Turkish coat that his niece wore in many portraits, and not just portraits, but in his more intimate paintings. So this Turkish coat keeps on reappearing, and there are photographs of Rosemary Ormond wearing it as well.
I mean, all these multi-layer.
Yes, it's not a simple picture.
I mean, it's not a simple picture, but it's also, I mean, also the other portraits. What is really fascinating, I mean, it's how the narrative, what you were saying and what you were describing to us, and then the vision of the portraits. I mean, it's a very dense narrative, and the portraits are really speaking to, I mean, it's really an amazing group. So I think we should conclude. There are many, Jean, one question that has been repeated so many times is when the book will be out. And I think Caroline has already answered, but let's repeat it. And also they were asking the title. What is the title of the book? So this, I think we can conclude on it.
Thank you very much. Everyone who's asked questions too. I'm hoping I will finish in another couple of months, maybe February of next year. And then it's up to the publisher, and I think my editor is watching. So it could come out at the end of next year or early 23, depending on the publisher's schedule. So we don't really know, but roughly a year from now, and or a little more. And the tentative title is Portrait of a Family, Sargent Wertheimers, or Sargent and the Wertheimers. I don't know. We're playing around with that. So, but I think it'll be something like that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Jean and Caroline, for the very engaging conversation, for the presentation, I mean, of this fantastic work in progress. And I look forward very much to reading the book. And I want also to remind our public that do not forget to register for the final talk that will happen this Thursday, the 9th, and will be a roundtable discussion about Jewish contribution to art dealing in London. So you can register as usual via the London Art Week website. And thank you again to everybody who was involved. Caroline and Jean, obviously.
Maybe just one last reminder that the portraits are on display at Tate Britain at the moment and until the 22nd of July next year.
So yes, and let's go visit with all this now preparation, visit Tate Britain and see this fabulous In Focus exhibition. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you all. Okay.
Bye.